I believe we are all free agents and have the option of good and evil, that the former brings happiness to individuals and nations, and the latter disaster. I believe I must expect sorrow. It is the order of its present state, if only for the reason that we must all age and have no regrets when we come to cross the bar. Eben James.
I am proud to be a citizen of Trenton. I hope I've been able to do a little to improve the lot of the people of Trenton. I don't care if people love me or hate me. I've got a job to do, and I intend to do it. William Alexander Fraser.
On October 7, 1884, photographer W. W. Higgins took this photo looking south from Trenton's Mount Pelion. The area of the shoreline has a much different look now, but shortly after this photo was taken, a business would begin to take shape on the Trenton waterfront that would endure until present times, mainly because of apples. There were other businesses already established in or near the village of Trenton. The Gilmore Lumber Company, built in 1852, was one of these, but it was forced to close because of the depletion of forests in the area by the early 1900s. Luckily, a new large facility was being built nearby on the waterfront which would welcome Gilmore's experienced workforce. The new business and the men behind it would influence the development of Trenton more than any other single company in the town's history. And two men, Ebenezer James and William Alexander Fraser, and their approach to business and family would go on to leave a legacy in the town of Trenton to this day. It all begins with an apple. Most people are not aware that apples continue to live after picking and need oxygen to ripen. Scientists found that if apples are sealed in a cold, low-oxygen environment, the ripening process is slowed dramatically. Today, under the right conditions, apples can survive up to 12 months in special storage vaults. The fruit trade really took off when two inventions came together to achieve a common purpose. Steam and its manifestation through railway locomotives and steamships joined ice making and refrigeration in enabling fruits and vegetables to travel for longer distances and over longer periods of time whilst arriving in a saleable and consumable state at their intended destination. The Canadian government led the way in experimenting with long-term storage and granted incentives to prospective entrepreneurs to build produce storage facilities. Canada was being hailed as the granary of the world, and Trenton was already beginning to become one of the central hubs of agriculture distribution in Ontario, with steamships or rail connecting it to the ports of the US and Montreal, which was the direct link to the European market. Eben James enjoyed good relationships with the major fruit buyers in the United Kingdom and stood to make a lot of money. Ebenezer James was born in England in the mid-1870s. He was raised by strict Baptist foster parents who sent him to boarding schools, and he never knew his own real birth date or who his natural parents were. Eben emigrated to Canada in 1889 when he thought he was 16 years old and started work as an apprentice to a rural Ontario storekeeper. He subsequently took a course at a commercial college in Stratford, Ontario, and then found work as an agent for British fruit importers. After being based in Montreal and Toronto for several years, Eben eventually settled in Trenton, where he had founded the Apple and Produce Cold Storage Company Limited. Eben had natural business instincts and knew how to get things going. Politically, he was a staunch conservative. However, with most other issues, for Eben things remained mainly black and white, in business and in everyday life. He suggested that people should do the right thing and ignore public opinion. In those days, public opinion on personal matters had no boundaries.
My father's a hero because this company should never have survived. The only reason it survived is because he kept at it and kept at it and kept at it. It's no reason, this company had no reason. The reason we call it Triumphant Journey is because there was no reason for the journey to ever complete. Like it should have been over in the 30s.
William Alexander Fraser was born in Trenton in 1886, the eldest of 5 children to a Scottish export customs collector and railway man, and the daughter of an American engineer. He was considered an average pupil, adventurous and athletic, with a love of sailing. He was a hard worker and a very hands-on learner with an amazing attention to detail.
Billy Fraser was brought up in a hard time. His father had been a banker with came here with the Molson's Bank. And my mother said if somebody came in and asked him for his coat, he would give him his best too. And he wasn't a businessman at all. And Fraser was left to try to support the family. And eventually the Molson's Bank, in those days, my mother told me, if you made a loan and it wasn't successful, you were expected to make up the loss. So eventually, of course, the bank, I'm sure, I have no records of this, but I think the bank let him out. His mother died in February, and that left a permanent scar on Fraser for the rest of his life. My mother told me that he did everything he could around the house to take the work away from her in looking after the family. She said my father had found these pictures on this wall came from the Fraser family. And she said we had fine books in the library, but we had no food on the table. And so that Fraser was the eldest son, and he kept it. He worked very hard to keep it together because of his mother. And my mother told me that it affected him. It really affected him a great deal.
He was a steadfast liberal who would eventually rise to yield tremendous power in the Quinte region as an industrialist, farmer, and political dynamo. He served as mayor in the 1920s and represented the riding of Northumberland in Parliament with the Liberal Party from 1930 through to 1945. He also served as chief whip in the Mackenzie King government and was later appointed to the Senate, where he remained until his death in 1962. Throughout his life, Billy Fraser devoted himself to building up his hometown of Trenton. He not only wanted to see the town grow and prosper, he was determined through his own effort to see that it did. He was a man of strong likes and dislikes, loyal to his friends, but could be hostile to those he perceived as enemies. He was ambitious and sensitive to public opinion. Enter 1902, the Apples and Produce Cold Storage and Forwarding Company Limited. A parliamentary act for the making and inspection of fruit to prevent fraudulent packing was passed in September 1901 and came into effect July 1, 1902. Closed packages and barrels of fruit would have to be marked with full names and the address of the packer, as well as with the variety of fruit and grade. Failure to comply or the use of false markings would bring stiff penalties. Eben and his partners incorporated their company and built a large storage facility that permitted 25,000 barrels of apples to be stored and forwarded by rail or water that first year. The cold storage, which was located on 1 3/4 acres of land, would handle apples, cheese, and other farm produce, including poultry. People said, "Several of our shrewd applemen have invested here, and the building half-built has been used of its utmost capacity this winter. All speak highly of its success." With one of the finest cold storage facilities in Ontario and a capacity of 60,000 barrels, and rail lines leading to waiting docks, it employed over 50 hands in the packing of precious apples. As an apple exporter, Eben had recently returned from a trip to California, where he visited the Newton-Pippin district. "I've been very much struck with the extreme care which the American growers take in their orchards. As one of the largest receivers of apples for export, and therefore having the interests of the Canadian growers very much at heart, I could not but compare these well-kept orchards with many of my own. An orchard cannot produce good fruit without proper care, any more than a cow can produce milk without food. A good apple crop can pay as well as any other crop a farmer can grow." In 1903, the apple yield was expected to be 2.5 million bushels, and increasing the next year. The other local storage facilities were filled to capacity and sent their excess to the large Trenton plant. Business was booming, and for several years Eben grew his profitable venture. However, he noticed the shortage of barrels at harvest time and how the price rose with the scarcity. So he proposed building one of the largest cooperages east of Toronto. Thus, the Trenton Cooperage Mills Limited was born, with Eben James as the principal owner. Billy Fraser started his working life as a day laborer packing apples in barrels at the Trenton Cold Storage Company, but like many young men of his time, headed west in a quest for gold, copper, and wealth, only to find himself riding a boxcar east back to Trenton, beaten but wiser. He had learned some hard lessons from his journey. Around 1908, when Eben James founded the Cooperage mill, he hired the young William Fraser as secretary of the new Cooperage operation. In letters, Billy initially praised his new boss, but later he became irritated by the way Eben lacked attention to the detailed day-to-day operations of the business. Billy would eventually take control and ownership of the Cooperage in what was to become one of the most controversial hostile takeovers Trenton would experience.
My father, I've got to tell it like it is, like I found it to be. My father was a great promoter. Fraser went to work for him when he built the cold storage plant, and there's letters where Fraser thanked him for being kind to him. Fraser was a detailed, hands-on guy. My father wasn't. And during the war, he became a recruitment officer and was tied up with the 49th Regiment in Kingston recruiting people. And I think if he'd got a commission, he might have stayed in the Army. And the Fraser ran the Cooperage business, and he worked very hard at it, and he was very successful at it. And my father let him run the Cooperage business, but he eventually wanted the Cooperage business. And there isn't any question about it. He took the Cooperage business away from my father.
Little did these two men realize that they were headed into a conflict that would span numerous changes in fortune, countless fires, 2 world wars, and the Depression years. The new situation. Apples. Apples were the adhesive that would forever bond these polar opposites. The growing, packing, and exporting all had to work hand in hand, and their relationship over the coming years would sour. Eben, for many years, courted Jeannie Fraser, Billy Fraser's younger sister, to the disapproval of Billy and the family.
My mother was a very strong character. She made a great liberal because she was always for the underdog. And when I was growing up in the Depression, there wouldn't be a day that we wouldn't have somebody knocking at the door, particularly in the winter months, looking for food. And she was having quite a problem putting food on the table for her own family. And she never let them leave that she didn't feed them. My mother loved my father dearly. There isn't any question about that. And I can remember telling a story that my father would play bridge at her father and mother's home, and people would come in, and Jeannie would serve on the table for lunch or what they gave, and Mom said that one of the women said, kidding James for not being married, and one of the women playing bridge said, well, Eben will probably pick up with a young girl like Jeannie.
They made no bones about the fact that their considerable age difference was one of the factors, but the greatest disapproval was politics. Eben was the president of the local Conservative Party, while the Frasers, including Jeannie, were unswerving liberals. Jeannie was known to be a strong, kind, and generous woman who would influence and hold both families together as best she could. In 1909, Billy's father purchased a 325-acre farm, which Billy would turn into a profitable apple orchard and eventually a 1,000-acre diverse holding called Glenburnie Farms, while Eben was, at the same time, expanding his cold storage business, now renamed Trenton Cold Storage. Misfortune and fire plagued Eben's efforts. However, he always managed to salvage the company using his shrewd business acumen. Eben had faith in his town, and they supported his efforts. But he was often away for business, traveling nationally and internationally. Meanwhile, Billy stayed hard at work building the Cooperage and involving himself in all aspects of its operation, becoming a community leader and influencer in most municipal affairs. As an Englishman, Eben felt the call of his king, and in 1908 he became a lieutenant of F Company 49th Regiment Hastings Rifles. He began training and planning for the day he could be on active service. More than anything, Billy wanted a family. The woman he chose to marry, against his family's wishes, was Blanche Macaulay. But the union of the unfortunate couple bore no children, and for the most part seemed unhappy. Though there would be no children in Billy's life, he mentored nieces and nephews. Some would disappoint him, while others would make him proud. Fraser continued to look for new opportunities to make money, becoming one of Trenton's most powerful businessmen. With his keen intellect, warm and friendly manner, he would financially back many endeavors, often becoming owner when the borrower failed to make good on repaying their debts. But when it came to politics, he was a formidable opponent. The change of plans. War changed everything, even the town of Trenton. Captain Eben James of the Hastings Rifles was now the district recruiting officer and devoted much time to his military duties and eventually hoped to receive his commission and go on to active service, while Billy did not hide the fact that he thought he could run the Cooperage mill much more efficiently than James. 1917 and 1918 were hard years for the Cooperage and strained years for the James-Fraser alliance. Through much wrangling, contracting, and loans, the reformed Trenton Cooperage Mills Limited was incorporated in 1918. Eben acquired full ownership of the new company and became president. Billy was appointed secretary, treasurer, and director, but by 1920 business relations between the two were at an all-time low. Eben was often away and left Billy to handle the details and problems of the business. By the end of 1920, Eben believed Billy was attempting to take over the Cooperage with a fraudulent scheme to annex his shares. Eben threatened legal action and outlined to his lawyer that the Cooperage was an auxiliary to the export business of the storage facility, so they needed to operate together. Eben also pointed out that he had put up the financing, while Billy had made no financial contribution. But Eben had incurred serious business setbacks from recent European war embargoes, which put everything at risk. Having little else but the equity in the storage and investment in the mill, he obtained a lucrative contract from the St. Lawrence Sugar Company and persuaded the bank to extend his line of credit. This became a watershed moment for Eben James and Billy Fraser. In a controversial war of words, Eben claimed that Billy threatened to upset the contract arrangement with St. Lawrence Sugar at the very last moment. Eben said the money being forwarded to him to purchase the new equipment required to fulfill the contract would have to be stopped, causing him to default on paying his line of credit, and that this would finish him financially, unless he agreed to some of Billy's concessions. Eben was over a barrel, and he knew it.
Al Cape on. And he went through it and he found, what had happened and how Fraser got the stock and the manipulation he did. And they had, during the war, they in order to keep going, they had to make sugar barrels and sugar for St. Lawrence Sugar. And they had to be made out of a better type of stock than apple barrels. And it took special equipment, and I know that St. Lawrence had advanced money in order for them to put the kind of equipment in they need to do this. And if you're a hands-on operator and the other guy is out doing the negotiating and that sort of thing, it doesn't take. I can see how Fraser would get control of the business, and I know that after my father died, he left a will, and we're reading the will. I'm at the table. Fraser's at the table, and my mother's at the table, and my father's talking about the rotten opposition he had, and he doesn't mention Fraser by name, but he's sitting there, and he's reading it too, and my mother's reading it, and I'm reading it, and I remember him saying to me on the boat later, "Why would I beat up on my sister's husband?" But there isn't any question, and I didn't answer that. But he did everything. Fraser didn't give me money, but if I had a business deal that he felt that I could make, he would support that. And I was never under the thoughts that he was going to, if I didn't make it, he would write it off. I knew that if I wasn't successful, he'd own the business, and it was a good relationship, because that's the only kind of relationship that lasts. You have to render unto Caesar what belongs to Caesar.
Billy had taken advantage of the fact that Eben had installed him as manager, despite the warnings of his associates. Billy had the power to usurp any of Eben's plans. Eben had made Billy manager so he could be available for active service overseas in the event his military commission was approved. Eben was discredited, and Billy's threatened backdoor dealing had thrown the Cooperage into liquidation with the bank. Eben and Billy had bought equal shares of the company, but the trouble did not end. Privately, Eben claimed that Billy had taken his equity in the Cooperage by trick, fraud, and misrepresentation, but never followed up with formal proceedings. Hurt and betrayed, Eben eventually resigned as president of the Cooperage and sold his shares to Billy and Billy's brothers. Eben married Jeannie months later and started their family.
His sister had a mind of her own, and she knew her brothers, and she knew what went on. She kept her family together. She raised her family, and she wasn't young when she got married. She stayed with her father, who had Alzheimer's, until he died. And according to my aunt, she dressed the body and looked after all that. And after that, she and my father went off and got married in Winnipeg and spent the winter out in California before going overseas. But my mother kept it all together. I think that's what I can say, and she deserves a great deal of credit, because her family was the most important thing to her. And my father never had family, and it was important to him.
Eben got the girl and kept his cold storage company. Which continues to grow and prosper under the leadership of Eben II and Eben III. But Eben James would leave this world in 1949, still bitter at Billy Fraser. Young Eben II would hold the reins of the cold storage and other ventures, but he also partnered and worked with Billy Fraser throughout the rest of Billy's life. He was warned by his father not to trust his nemesis. Eben had told him at a young age, "You're playing with Fraser. I'm not against it, but I want you to know that one day he will turn on you." And eventually he did.
He was a hard worker. He'd grown up in the jungle of the 20s and the 30s, and if he was your friend, you had a wonderful friend. But if for any reason he wasn't your friend, you had an enemy. And I made sure that as far as I was concerned, and as far as he was concerned, the dealings that I were involved with, that he was kept fully appraised of what was going on all the time. And I not only built a wonderful relationship with him, but I brought everything back together that had started out.
There is nothing following explaining how Fraser turned against Eben II. Still, it did not erode the loyalty the two felt for each other. After all, they were family. But Billy got the Cooperage, which, together with Glen Burnie Farms, would become the start of his colorful, ambitious, and illustrious career. Billy Fraser was president, and the Cooperage enjoyed continued success until 1948, when it started to flounder, until its closing in 1958. But by then, Billy had moved on to bigger things, both in politics and business. Billy Fraser pursued a variety of business interests, including the regional newspapers, movie theaters, and a bridge-building company. For more than a quarter century, Billy was a Trenton-centric political powerhouse. As mayor, he served 7 consecutive terms. Throughout, his connections brought a number of new industries to Trenton. As an MP, he helped land the Bata Shoe Company factory at Battawa. Another of his ventures was Central Bridge Company, which manufactured over 100 invasion tugs during the Second World War. He was known as Nickel Billy, perhaps in reference to his business skills. An avid sailing enthusiast, he owned a boat, the Portia, for over 30 years. The Portia was thought to be lost, but like the character of the same name in Shakespeare's Merchant of Venice, seemed unsinkable, as it was discovered in 2019, still afloat and totally refurbished. The Fraser House, located near the crest of the hill on Dundas Street, was demolished in April of 1974. The property was located on one full block bordered by Dundas Street, Catherine Street, Henry Street, and McClellan Avenue. The front portion of the building was part of the original farmhouse, dating back to the 1850s. As mayor, Billy beseeched everyone he knew to consider placing an airbase in Trenton. A major airbase would be a godsend to an economically depressed community. A finely honed municipal politician, he had a network of political connections with people in powerful places. He would make it happen.
Fraser has to be given full credit for that. There's no question about it. The air base, there isn't any argument about it. If you read Howard Graham's book, I think it was Soldier or Statesman, and he was a Trenton boy and was on the council with him in 1930. And Graham said that the base was here because of the efforts of Billy Fraser. Yeah, oh yeah. And he, most of the industry, up to the time he died, I would say 70% of the industry in Trenton could be put to his doorstep for bringing them here.
Fraser attempted to move into federal politics by taking on the Tory candidate Milton Edgar Mabie in 1925. He lost, but had better luck in 1930, defeating Mabie by 1,000 votes. Billy held the Northumberland riding until his retirement in 1945. People fully expected him to be called to the Senate after his retirement, and in September 1949, he took his seat as Senator William Fraser. Fraser started the Trentonian newspaper with the younger James after the local paper continually printed defamatory statements about him.
I am proud to be a citizen of Trenton. I hope I've been able to do a little to improve the lot of the people of Trenton. I don't care if people love me or hate me. I've got a job to do, and I intend to do it.
We are told that the star under which we have been born gives to our lives its character. Therefore, I conclude that mine must have been one of hope, because despite all the obstacles and disappointments I have met with, I am still a practical optimist. I'm not living in a dreamy future, but that the forces of good and evil are at least equally divided, and that life is full of possibilities that I may live to see realized. Eben James. These two prominent men substantially formed and grew the town of Trenton, and their collective endeavors should never be forgotten.